You think race car drivers only crave speed? You don't know the Paul family. John Paul Sr. owned a championship endurance team, but he was actually a ruthless cartel kingpin running a multi-million-dollar smuggling empire. He hollowed out his 18-wheel racing haulers to move tons of Colombian narcotics right past highway patrol, dragging his own teenage son and co-driver directly into the criminal underworld. When the FBI finally closed the net, the father operated like a mafia hitman, pumping 5 hollow point rounds into a federal witness before triggering a global manhunt. After serving hard time, the fugitive vanished permanently into the ocean in 2001. This is the most violent, highly organized criminal conspiracy in American motorsport history, and the federal file remains wide open. Join us as we investigate the biggest drug smuggling case in IndyCar history. John Paul Sr. was born Hans Johann Paul in the Netherlands in 1939. His family immigrated to the United States and settled in Muncie, Indiana. He was highly intelligent and completely devoid of empathy. He viewed people as tools and systems, as things to be exploited. After securing admission to Harvard Business School and graduating into the ruthless financial sector of the 1960s, he took over the Wall Street Fund. By manipulating capital, he built a small fortune, quickly mastering how to hide money, move assets, and exploit tax loopholes. But sitting behind a desk did not satisfy his severe need for adrenaline and dominance. In the late 1960s, he bought a Chevrolet Corvette. He started entering local Sports Car Club of America events. He realized he possessed a natural, calculated aggression behind the wheel. He won races because he was willing to push the machinery closer to catastrophic failure than the other men on the grid. He discarded the Corvette and bought into the Porsche ecosystem. The German engineering suited his clinical mindset. He formed his own privateer team. He named it JLP Racing. He set up shop in Lawrenceville, Georgia. He hired top-tier mechanics. He expected absolute perfection. When mechanics made minor errors, he did not dock their pay. He hurled heavy steel wrenches at their heads. He demanded total submission. The International Motorsports Association, or IMSA, sanctioned the highest level of sports car racing in North America. By the late 1970s, IMSA was expanding rapidly. The grid featured factory-backed teams from major automotive manufacturers. These teams had millions of dollars in corporate funding. JLP Racing was a private, independent operation. Yet John Paul Sr. arrived at the tracks with equipment that rivaled or exceeded the factory operations. He purchased the best chassis. He bought limitless supplies of racing slicks. He hired specialized engine builders to tear down the Porsche flat six motors and rebuild them to exact tolerances. The financial burn rate was staggering. A single weekend of endurance racing cost tens of thousands of dollars in parts and fuel alone. The other teams in the paddock noticed the influx of cash. They saw the brand new transport trucks. They saw the private airplanes John Paul Sr. flew to the tracks. The math did not align with a retired mutual fund manager running a privateer team. The suspicion was widespread, but nobody spoke to federal authorities. The racing community operated on a strict code of silence. As long as a team passed technical inspection, the source of their funding was ignored. The truth was heavily insulated. JLP Racing was a logistical front. John Paul Sr. was operating one of the largest transnational marijuana smuggling syndicates in the United States. He completely bypassed low-level street dealing. He operated at the wholesale cartel level. He established direct connections with suppliers in Colombia. He organized massive shipments of narcotics. He did not move small quantities in the trunks of cars. He moved thousands of pounds of high-grade marijuana on maritime vessels. He purchased coastal properties and utilized the isolated bayous of Louisiana and the dark coastlines of the southeastern United States. His boats navigated through the Gulf of Mexico under the cover of darkness. They offloaded the contraband onto the docks in the middle of the night. This was where the racing team became the perfect cover. Endurance racing required massive logistical support. Teams traveled across the country in massive 18-wheel transport trucks. These haulers were heavily customized. They contained sleeping quarters, machine shops, spare engines, and multiple race cars. John Paul Sr. recognized that highway patrol units rarely inspected professional racing haulers. State troopers saw the bright JLP racing logos, the aerodynamic trailers, and the expensive equipment. They waved the trucks through weigh stations. They assumed it was just another team heading to Road Atlanta or Sebring. Inside those customized trailers, hidden behind the fiberglass body panels of the Porsche 935s and underneath the heavy tool chests, were hundreds of tightly packed bales of Colombian marijuana. The haulers moved the narcotics across state lines with complete impunity. The operation generated millions of dollars in untraceable cash. Senior set up offshore bank accounts to launder the proceeds. He funneled the dirty money back into the racing operation through shell companies. The faster the cars went, the better the cover became. Winning races provided legitimacy. While the smuggling empire expanded, a new variable entered the JLP racing garage. John Paul Jr. was born in 1960. His parents divorced when he was young. He lived with his mother. He had very little contact with his father during his early childhood. Senior was entirely focused on his financial career and his own pursuits. As a teenager, Junior sought a connection with the father he barely knew. He traveled to the JLP racing shop. He did not ask for a seat in a race car. He picked up a broom, he swept the concrete floors, he cleaned the grease off the engine blocks, he organized the tool chests. He wanted to be part of the environment. He watched the mechanics work on the complex suspension geometry. He listened to the engines detonate on the dynamometer. Eventually, his father put him in a low-horsepower Formula Ford open-wheel car. The vehicle was basic. It had no aerodynamic downforce. It relied entirely on mechanical grip and driver input. John Paul Jr. strapped in and drove. The telemetry data and stopwatch times revealed a terrifying fact. The teenage boy was exceptionally fast. He was naturally gifted. Unlike his father, who drove with raw aggression and brute force, Junior was incredibly smooth. He understood weight transfer. He understood how to preserve the tires. He hit the apex of every corner with mechanical precision. He did not overdrive the car. He extracted the maximum potential from the machinery without destroying it. This was the exact skill set required for endurance racing. A driver had to run fast lap times consistently for hours without breaking the transmission or boiling the brake fluid. Senior recognized the talent immediately. He did not view his son with parental pride. He viewed him as an asset. He saw a co-driver who could help him win the biggest races on the calendar. He pulled his son out of the lower formulas and thrust him directly into the highest tier of sports car racing. In 1979, John Paul Jr. entered the IMSA GT Championship. He was a teenager driving a 700-horsepower Porsche 935 against grown men, seasoned professionals, and Formula One veterans. He did not flinch. He adapted to the extreme heat and the brutal steering instantly. He proved he belonged on the track. But the racing was only half of the family business. Senior demanded absolute loyalty from everyone in his orbit. He integrated his son into the smuggling syndicate. He did not protect him from the criminal underworld. He used him. Junior was desperate for his father's approval. He wanted to maintain his position in the race car. He agreed to help. At 15 years old, the future racing champion was assigned manual labor in the dark. He stood on the docks in the middle of the night. He grabbed heavy bales of marijuana wrapped in plastic and burlap. He loaded them onto the trucks. He inhaled the dust and the smell of the contraband. He knew exactly where the money was coming from. The two men were now bound by blood, high-octane fuel, and federal felonies. The Louisiana air was heavy and stagnant on the night of January 10th, 1979. Law enforcement officers killed their headlights and idled their patrol cruisers near a desolate bayou dock. They watched a boat cut through the dark water. The vessel was riding low. It was overloaded with massive bales of Colombian marijuana. The officers executed a tactical raid. They surrounded the dock with drawn weapons. They illuminated the area with high-intensity spotlights. The raid was violently fast. They caught the smugglers in the middle of the offload, one of the men standing on the wooden planks, surrounded by millions of dollars in illegal narcotics, was 19-year-old John Paul Jr. The teenage racing prodigy was physically restrained. Officers locked steel handcuffs around his wrists and shoved him against the hood of a police cruiser. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and booked on felony drug smuggling charges. This was not a minor street-level possession offense. It was a high-level cartel operation. The physical weight of the evidence was staggering. The arrest should have permanently ended his racing career. It should have sent him to a federal penitentiary for a decade. John Paul Sr. intervened immediately. He did not let the legal system process his son normally. He deployed his vast, untraceable financial resources. He bypassed public defenders and bought the most aggressive, high-priced criminal defense attorneys available. The lawyers manipulated the legal machinery. They cited his youth. They pointed to his lack of prior felony convictions. They negotiated a highly favorable plea deal. John Paul Jr. received 3 years of probation. He walked out of the courthouse a free man. He went straight back to the racetrack. The near miss with federal prison did not act as a deterrent. It acted as an accelerant. John Paul Sr. realized the operational window was closing. The federal heat was increasing. He needed to wash more money at a significantly faster rate. He poured millions of dollars in drug profits directly into the JLP Racing Engineering Department. Standard factory Porsche 935s were no longer sufficient to secure victories and launder the required capital. Senior demanded bespoke, highly illegal weapons. He hired master chassis builder Chuck Gaw of GACO. Completely bypassing the IMSA rulebook, they stripped the German cars down to the bare metal and discarded the heavy factory floor pans. In their place, the team welded custom, lightweight chromally tubular space frames and engineered radical ground effect aerodynamics that sucked the car down to the asphalt. They built the JLP-2 and the legendary JLP-3. These were not standard race cars. They were prototype machines. Forced into a production car class, the JLP-3 was an engineering monster. It featured a massive specialized rear wing and an aggressively sloped front nose designed to slice through the air at 210 miles per hour. Mechanics fitted the 3.2-liter flat-six engines with mechanical fuel injection and twin KKKK turbochargers. The engine builders pushed the tolerances to the absolute limit. The motors produced over 800 horsepower on high boost qualifying settings. The power delivery was violently abrupt. There was a massive turbo lag. The driver would hit the throttle, wait 2 seconds, and then the horsepower would hit the rear wheels like a sledgehammer. The massive rear tires would spin loose in fourth gear. Controlling the JLP3 required extreme physical endurance and a complete disregard for personal safety. The cockpit was a rolling oven. Heat radiated directly from the massive turbochargers mounted just inches behind the driver's firewall. Cabin temperatures routinely exceeded 140 degrees. There was no power steering. There were no anti-lock brakes. The drivers wrestled a heavy, stiff steering wheel for hours at a time. The G-forces punished their necks and compressed their spines. Dehydration was severe. Drivers lost up to 10 pounds of water weight during a single stint. They inhaled toxic exhaust fumes. John Paul Jr. thrived in this brutal environment. He drove with cold mechanical precision. He preserved the heavy 4-speed gearbox. He managed the severe tire degradation. His father drove with sheer intimidating blunt force. Sr. would intentionally crowd other drivers off the racing line. He used the heavy fiberglass fenders of the Porsche as a battering ram to clear traffic. The 1982 IMSA season was the absolute peak of the JLP racing empire. The father and son entered the 24 Hours of Daytona in January. It was the most grueling endurance race in North America. The grid was packed with legendary drivers and factory-supported operations. JLP Racing arrived with the JLP3 and a bottomless budget. They brought spare engines, spare transmissions, and a small army of highly paid technicians. Their pit stall looked like a military operation. The race was a mechanical war of attrition. Engines detonated under the strain. Suspension snapped over the 31-degree banking. Cars caught fire in the pit lane. The JLP3 ran relentlessly. Junior drove through the night. He navigated the dark infield corners and held the throttle wide open on the banking. He systematically outdrove the factory Porsche entries. After 24 hours of constant physical and mechanical abuse, the father and son crossed the finish line first. They won the overall victory. 6 weeks later, they transported the operation to the 12 Hours of Sebring. The Sebring track surface was notoriously destructive. It was built on an abandoned World War II concrete airfield. The harsh seams in the concrete violently battered the suspension joints. The bumps tore the aerodynamic splitters off the front of the cars. The steering columns violently kicked back, blistering the driver's hands. It was a test of raw mechanical survival. Once again, JLP Racing annihilated the competition. They won the overall victory. Winning Daytona and Sebring in the same calendar year was a monumental achievement in motorsport. It cemented their legacy in the record books. Junior continued his rampage through the rest of the season. He won races at Road Atlanta, Laguna Seca, and Mid-Ohio. He captured the 1982 IMSA Camel GT Championship. He was 22 years old. He was the youngest champion in series history. He held massive championship trophies. He was featured on the cover of national racing magazines. The public saw a dominant racing dynasty. Federal investigators saw a massive, highly organized criminal conspiracy. The United States Customs Service, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the FBI were quietly assembling a joint task force. They were not looking at lap times. They were looking at bank ledgers. They tracked the movements of the heavily customized JLP racing transport trucks. They monitored the offshore bank accounts in the Bahamas. They identified the shell companies. They mapped the maritime routes from Colombia. The federal agents started flipping low-level smugglers. They offered immunity deals to boat captains and dock workers, facing mandatory minimum sentences. The informants pointed directly at the JLP racing garage in Lawrenceville. The paranoia began to consume the father. The pressure of the impending federal indictments fractured his mind. He became highly suspicious of his own mechanics. He believed his crew members were wearing federal recording devices. The millions of dollars in the bank could not stop the federal warrants. The high-horsepower prototypes could not outrun the Department of Justice. The perfect facade was cracking. The smell of high-octane racing fuel was being replaced by the scent of federal subpoenas and impending violence. The federal task force assembling the racketeering case against JLP Racing had a massive head start. They were not just tracking maritime smuggling routes and offshore bank accounts. They had been forced to coordinate with homicide detectives. The operation had crossed a definitive line. The federal agents were dealing with a highly organized drug syndicate, but they were also dealing with a severe psychological anomaly. John Paul Sr. was not a standard cartel lieutenant who followed orders. He was an apex predator operating with absolute impunity. The pressure of the impending federal indictments acted like a stress test on a flawed engine block. The microfractures in his psyche expanded into full structural failure. The paddock saw his violent pathology. His mechanics felt it. He regularly threw heavy steel tools at crew members. If a mechanic misaligned a suspension component or cross-threaded a bolt on a turbocharger housing, Sr. did not issue a verbal reprimand. He hurled a half-inch drive torque wrench directly at the man's head. He ruled his immediate circle through severe physical intimidation. He lacked basic human empathy. Forensic psychologists later classified his behavior patterns as strictly sociopathic. He viewed his personnel, his competitors, and his own family as expendable assets. He just happened to wear a fireproof racing suit while he operated. This violent pathology completely infected his personal life. His first marriage collapsed under the weight of his absolute control. He quickly identified a new target. Her name was Chalice Paul. She married him and stepped directly into a highly volatile, high-stakes criminal environment. The JLP racing shop in Lawrenceville, Georgia, was not a standard garage. It was a heavily fortified distribution hub. Chalice witnessed the millions of dollars in untraceable cash moving through the facility. She saw the armed men guarding the perimeters. She knew the names of the boat captains. She knew the specific logistical coordinates of the Gulf of Mexico offload points. In the context of a transnational narcotics syndicate, that level of knowledge is a massive operational liability. The timeline of her life intersected directly with the destabilization of the drug empire. In the summer of 1981, the internal tension inside the organization reached a critical threshold. Law enforcement task forces were actively pulling financial records. Subpoenas were being drafted by the Department of Justice. John Paul Sr. and Chalice traveled to Key West, Florida. They boarded a private boat. It was documented as a delayed honeymoon. It was the last time anyone definitively saw her alive. Chalice Paul vanished in July 1981. She disappeared without a single trace in the dense, humid environment of the Florida Keys. The circumstances surrounding her absence were immediately suspicious to local law enforcement. John Paul Sr. returned from the open water alone. Navigating the vessel back to the dock, he secured the mooring lines and shut down the engines. He never picked up the marine radio to broadcast a mayday, nor did he contact the Coast Guard or walk into a local police precinct to file a missing persons report. He simply packed his personal gear, left the boat, and went back to managing the race team. He operated with a chilling level of cold, mechanical normalcy. He compartmentalized the event with terrifying efficiency. He was actively checking tire pressures and suspension geometry on the Porsche prototypes while a human being was systematically erased from existence. Weeks passed. Chalice's family and friends realized she was gone. The phone calls stopped. The letters stopped. They could not reach her through any channel. They contacted Florida authorities. Key West Police Department detectives knocked on John Paul Sr.'s door. His reaction was clinically detached. He provided a formal statement to the investigators. His narrative was fractured, highly defensive, and mechanically impossible. He claimed his wife simply walked away from the marriage. He stated she left him on the docks, walked into the local Key West nightlife, and disappeared into the crowd. The timeline did not align with basic forensic reality. Detectives secured search warrants. Her personal belongings, including her clothing and identification, were left behind on the boat. Her bank accounts showed absolutely zero activity. There were no outbound commercial flights purchased under her name. There were no rental car records. There were no bus tickets. Her passport was completely untouched. She had no financial footprint and no physical footprint. The Key West detectives and federal agents analyzed the data points. The objective facts pointed to a singular, brutal conclusion. Human beings do not evaporate into the Florida humidity without capital or identification. Chalice Paul knew too much about the international narcotics syndicate. She was legally bound to the primary target of a massive federal racketeering investigation. Law enforcement officially shifted their operational perspective. The drug-smuggling case absorbed a suspected homicide investigation. John Paul Sr. was immediately classified as the prime suspect. Detectives brought him into an interrogation room. He remained completely stoic. He treated the interrogation like a corporate contract negotiation. He offered zero concessions. He provided no actionable intelligence. He knew the exact parameters of the law. Without a body, the local district attorney lacked the forensic evidence required to secure a murder indictment. There was no active crime scene to process. There was no murder weapon recovered from the ocean floor. There was no toxicology report to run. There was no blunt force trauma to analyze. There was only a massive void where his wife used to exist. Senior leveraged the complete lack of physical evidence. He walked out of the police station a free man. He returned to the JLP racing garage. He acted as if Chalice Paul had never existed. John Paul Jr. was trapped in the immediate blast radius. The young driver was forced to process the cold reality that his father was a prime suspect in the disappearance of his stepmother. Junior kept his mouth shut to survive. He kept his foot pinned to the floorboard. He focused entirely on the machinery. He won the 1982 IMSA championship, while his family structure disintegrated into a federal criminal case. He chose the race car over confronting the horrific nature of his father. The disappearance sent shock waves through the lower levels of the criminal syndicate. The smugglers and mechanics realized the stakes had fundamentally changed. Moving bales of marijuana across the Gulf of Mexico carried a manageable federal prison sentence. Accessory to murder was a completely different category of risk. The paranoia inside the organization spiked dramatically. Associates began to look at John Paul Sr. not as a boss, but as a terminal threat. If he was willing to eliminate his own wife to protect the operational security of the cartel, nobody in the crew was safe. The strict wall of silence began to crack under the pressure. Smugglers started looking for immediate exit strategies. The mechanics of loyalty broke down. Associates started making quiet, desperate phone calls to federal prosecutors. They wanted immediate immunity. They were willing to trade the racing champion to the FBI in exchange for their own survival. The empire was actively eating itself from the inside out. The federal net was tightening, and John Paul Sr. recognized the internal collapse. He began preparing a violent countermeasure to protect his freedom. The structural integrity of the JLP racing syndicate completely collapsed in the early months of 1983. The federal task force stopped observing from a distance and initiated direct kinetic action. Agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, and United States Customs executed a coordinated multi-state takedown. They breached the Lawrenceville, Georgia racing headquarters. They did not care about the IMSA championship trophies. They seized the banking ledgers. They impounded the massive 18-wheel transport haulers and systematically tore them apart with heavy cutting equipment, exposing the hidden fiberglass smuggling compartments. The United States Department of Justice began issuing federal subpoenas to every mechanic, boat captain, and logistical coordinator connected to the operation. The federal strategy was standard and highly effective. They targeted the foundation of the syndicate. They threatened low-level operatives with 20-year mandatory minimum sentences in federal penitentiaries. The threat of decades behind reinforced steel doors broke their loyalty instantly. The strict code of silence that protected John Paul Sr. dissolved. Stephen Carson was a primary logistical operator within the smuggling ring. He was not a driver or a mechanic. He managed the maritime routes. He knew the specific coordinates of the offshore offload points. Most importantly, he knew exactly how John Paul Sr. directed the flow of millions of dollars in illegal narcotics and laundered cash. Carson was caught in the initial federal net. He sat in a cold interrogation room and looked at the evidence matrix the FBI had built against him. He calculated the mathematical reality of his situation. He made a clinical decision to survive. He signed a cooperation agreement. He became an active informant for the federal government. He agreed to take the witness stand in open court and systematically detail the criminal operations of his former boss. The FBI attempted to place him under the radar, but the criminal underworld is highly porous. Word of the betrayal leaked back to the JLP racing operation. John Paul Sr. received the intelligence. He processed the information without emotion. He did not hire an external contractor to eliminate the threat. He viewed Stephen Carson as a defective, highly dangerous component in his machine. He decided to execute the federal witness himself. On April 19, 1983, the violence spilled out of the shadows and directly onto the asphalt in St. Augustine, Florida. Carson was moving through a boat ramp parking lot. John Paul Sr. had tracked his movements. Sr. ambushed him. He was armed with a heavy caliber handgun. He did not issue a warning or a threat. He physically overpowered Carson. The tactical objective was to force Carson into the trunk of a parked vehicle, transport him to a secondary isolated location, and eliminate him cleanly without leaving forensic evidence. Carson recognized the tactical situation. He knew he was about to be murdered. He violently resisted. He fought against being locked inside the metal compartment. The physical struggle escalated on the pavement. Sr. realized he was losing control of the immediate environment. Witnesses could appear at any second. He abandoned the transport plan. He raised the firearm. He pulled the trigger at point-blank range. He fired 5 rounds directly into Carson's body. The heavy lead projectiles tore through muscle, shattered bone, and destroyed internal organs. Carson collapsed onto the concrete. He absorbed massive ballistic trauma. Sr. assessed the target, assumed the wounds were fatal, and immediately fled the scene. He left his former associate bleeding out on the asphalt. The execution was a mechanical failure. Carson did not die. Local paramedics responded to the scene. They stabilized his vitals in the back of an ambulance. Trauma surgeons in the emergency bay extracted the lead from his chest and abdomen. They clamped his severed arteries. Carson survived the 5 gunshot wounds. As soon as he regained consciousness, he identified his shooter directly to law enforcement. The attempted murder of a cooperating federal witness instantly elevated John Paul Sr. to the absolute top of the FBI's priority target list. The federal government mobilized a massive nationwide manhunt. Federal warrants were immediately issued for attempted murder, racketeering, and international narcotics trafficking. Sr. knew the execution failed. He knew the full weight of the United States Department of Justice was hunting him. He abandoned the multi-million-dollar race team. He abandoned his coastal properties. He tapped into his hidden offshore financial reserves. He acquired forged identification documents. He bypassed customs checkpoints and fled the United States. The former IMSA champion became a highly classified international fugitive. The FBI tracked the fugitive across the globe. Agents monitored his financial wires. They flagged his known offshore accounts. Sr. attempted to disappear into the European banking capital. He established a new covert life in Geneva, Switzerland. He operated under a stolen identity. He believed the geographic distance and the notoriously strict Swiss financial privacy laws would shield him from American law enforcement. He severely miscalculated the reach of the federal government. The FBI coordinated directly with Interpol and Swiss federal police. They mapped his daily movements in Geneva. They identified his specific location. Heavily armed Swiss tactical units breached his perimeter. They cornered him. He had no turbocharged Porsches to escape in. He had no firearms to deploy. Swiss police clamped heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists. They locked him in a European holding cell and initiated the international extradition process. John Paul Sr. was loaded onto a federal transport plane, flown back across the Atlantic Ocean, and handed over to United States Marshals. The courtroom proceedings were brief and brutal. The federal prosecutors laid out a mountain of forensic evidence. They had the seized banking ledgers. They had the confiscated maritime vessels. They had the surviving victim of a 5-shot execution attempt ready to testify. The defense strategy completely crumbled. Facing absolute defeat, John Paul Sr. pleaded guilty to racketeering, drug smuggling, and the attempted murder of Stephen Carson. The federal judge handed down a massive sentence. He received 25 years in federal prison. He was stripped of his wealth. He was stripped of his freedom. He was transported to a maximum security federal penitentiary. The man who once flew private jets to Daytona was assigned a federal inmate number and locked inside a concrete cell. The federal prosecution did not stop with the father. The Department of Justice targeted John Paul Jr. They indicted the young racing champion on racketeering and drug smuggling charges based on his involvement in the offload operations. Federal prosecutors squeezed the young driver. They placed him in an interrogation room. They offered him a massive reduction in prison time. The condition was simple and non-negotiable. He had to take the witness stand and testify against his father. He had to publicly detail the logistics of the JLP racing syndicate. Junior sat at the table. He looked at the federal agents. He refused the deal. He chose family loyalty over his own freedom. He refused to say a single word against the man who had dragged him into a transnational cartel. That refusal destroyed his career. In May 1986, John Paul Jr. stood in front of a federal judge. He pleaded guilty to racketeering charges. The court sentenced him to 5 years in a federal correctional institution. The timing was brutally precise. Junior was 26 years old. He was entering the absolute physical and mental prime of his professional racing career. He had just set the fastest qualifying lap at the Indianapolis 500 a few years prior. He was highly sought after by top-tier IndyCar and factory IMSA teams. Instead of signing multi-million-dollar contracts, he was handcuffed and transported to a federal prison camp. He traded a carbon fiber steering wheel for a heavy cotton uniform. The fastest young driver in American motorsport was completely neutralized. The massive roll-up doors of the JLP racing garage were padlocked by the federal government. The dynasty was officially erased from the grid. The federal penal system processed John Paul Sr. in 1983. They stripped him of his tailored suits and his Rolex. They issued him heavy cotton institutional clothing and a federal inmate number. They locked him inside a high-security United States penitentiary. The 25-year sentence was a mathematical certainty. The federal government expected him to age and deteriorate inside a 6 by 9 foot concrete box. But his sociopathic nature did not recognize federal authority. He viewed the prison layout as a mechanical diagram. He studied the guard rotations. He identified vulnerabilities in the perimeter protocols. He did not plan to serve his time. He planned a breach. In 1987, he initiated a hostile, violent escape attempt. He lacked access to firearms or high explosives. He relied on crude chemistry and brute force. He acquired hot sauce from the inmate commissary. The liquid contained high levels of capsaicin. He manipulated a janitorial detail and stole a supply of industrial pine sol cleaner. The bleach contained highly corrosive sodium hypochlorite. He concealed the liquids in his cell. He mixed them together to manufacture a volatile, blinding chemical agent. He waited for a specific federal corrections officer to approach his position on the cell block. He did not issue a warning. He ambushed the guard. He deployed the toxic chemical mixture at point-blank range, spraying it directly into the officer's ocular cavity. The immediate tactical objective was absolute. He intended to burn the guard's corneas, incapacitate him, secure his heavy iron keyring, and bypass the reinforced steel doors leading to the exterior yard. The execution failed immediately. The corrections officer absorbed the chemical attack. He sustained severe burns to his eyes and face, but his training engaged. He fought back. He physically grappled with the former racing champion. He triggered his personal body alarm. The piercing siren activated the block lockdown protocol. A heavily armored tactical response team flooded the tier. They neutralized John Paul Sr. with overwhelming blunt force. They slammed him onto the concrete floor. They restrained his wrists and ankles in heavy steel shackles. The escape attempt was completely crushed. The Bureau of Prisons reclassified him as an extreme flight risk and a violent threat to staff. They dragged him away from the general population. They threw him into the special housing unit. He was placed in 23-hour solitary confinement. He stared at a solid steel door. The federal government added more time to his sentence. He sat in the dark and aged. He did not rehabilitate. He simply waited for the calendar to turn. He remained locked in the federal system until his mandatory release protocols were triggered in July 1999. John Paul Jr. absorbed his federal prison sentence in a completely different manner. He was processed into a lower security federal camp. He kept his mouth shut. He did not assault guards. He followed the schedule. He served his 30 months in silence. He watched the absolute prime physiological years of his athletic window evaporate behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The federal government unlocked the gates in October 1988. He was 28 years old. He stepped onto the asphalt with nothing. He was a convicted felon. The multi-million-dollar JLP racing infrastructure was completely erased. Federal agents had seized the bank accounts. They had impounded and auctioned off the custom Porsche chassis. The maritime smuggling boats were in government lockup. Corporate America wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. Top-tier factory racing teams refused his phone calls. They viewed his felony conviction as a massive public relations liability. He had zero financial backing. He had to rebuild his career from the ground up, relying purely on his raw physiological reflexes and his spatial awareness. He returned to the paddock and took any seat he could find. He strapped into underfunded, uncompetitive machinery. He drove heavily outgunned cars in the IMSA GTP class. He entered the kart open-wheel series. He drove chassis that lacked the aerodynamic downforce and advanced engine mapping of the leading teams. He compensated for the mechanical deficits with extreme physical exertion. He pushed flawed cars to their absolute structural limits. The garage area recognized his speed, but the stigma of the federal indictment remained permanently attached to his fire suit. The comeback was physically punishing. He entered the Indianapolis 500. During a practice session in 1993, a mechanical failure sent his car violently into the concrete retaining wall. The telemetry data recorded a colossal G-force spike. The impact fractured his spine. He broke his back. Trauma surgeons fused his vertebrae. He underwent grueling physical rehabilitation. He healed his bone structure, climbed back into the cockpit, and kept driving. The relentless grind finally produced a result in 1998. He signed a contract with Team Pelfrey in the newly formed Indy Racing League. The team operated with mid-pack equipment. On September 20th, 1998, he rolled onto the starting grid at Texas Motor Speedway for the Lone Star 500. The track was a 1.5-mile quad oval with brutal 24-degree banking. The ambient heat was suffocating. The race was a high-speed drafting war. Cars ran inches apart at 215 miles per hour. A singular mistake in steering input meant a catastrophic impact with the safer barrier. Junior executed a flawless, highly calculated race. He managed the fuel consumption of the naturally aspirated Oldsmobile V8 engine. He preserved the heavy Firestone tires. He navigated the turbulent air behind the race leaders. He capitalized on the mechanical failures of the front runners. After 208 laps of intense physical punishment, he crossed the start-finish line in first place. It was his first major victory since the federal task force dismantled his life in the early 1980s. He parked the car in victory lane. He unbuckled his harnesses. He climbed out of the cockpit. He proved the federal government could confiscate his money and his freedom, but they could not extract his driving talent. The validation was temporary. By 2001, the machinery inside his own biology initiated a catastrophic failure sequence. He was testing a prototype sports car. He noticed a microscopic delay in his reaction time. His right foot did not transition from the throttle to the brake pedal with the required snap. His steering inputs felt slightly disconnected. In a race car traveling at 190 miles per hour, a delay of 50 milliseconds is the exact difference between hitting the apex and hitting the wall. He recognized the mechanical flaw in his own nervous system. He stepped out of the car and underwent a massive medical evaluation. Neurologists drew his blood. They mapped his genetic code. They analyzed his motor functions. They delivered a lethal, non-negotiable verdict. He tested positive for Huntington's disease. It is a fatal genetic disorder. It triggers the progressive, irreversible degeneration of nerve cells in the brain. The basal ganglia systematically deteriorates. The disease dismantles muscle coordination, cognitive function, and eventually the autonomic nervous system. There is no surgical intervention. There is no chemical cure. It is a biological death sentence. The man who survived a broken back, a federal penitentiary, and thousands of hours inside volatile race cars was defeated by a microscopic genetic mutation. He was forced to permanently surrender his competition license. He walked away from the track. His body began a slow, agonizing shutdown. The man who survived a broken back, a federal penitentiary, and thousands of hours inside volatile race cars was defeated by a microscopic genetic mutation. He was forced to permanently surrender his competition license. He walked away from the track. His body began a slow, agonizing shutdown. Simultaneously, the federal prison system unlocked the steel doors for his father. In July 1999, John Paul Sr. walked out of the penitentiary. He was 60 years old. He was a convicted international drug smuggler, a failed attempted murderer, and the prime suspect in an unclosed homicide investigation. The Bureau of Prisons released him onto the streets of Florida under strict federal parole. The multi-million-dollar JLP racing infrastructure was completely gone. The offshore cartel accounts were seized. He was stripped of his heavy transport trucks and his turbocharged Porsches, but his core sociopathic pathology remained fully active. He did not seek a quiet, rehabilitated retirement. The violent old man immediately began scouting for a new revenue stream and a new victim. He relocated to the Fort Lauderdale area. He blended into the wealthy, transient maritime culture of South Florida. He acquired a 55-foot boat named the Diamond Girl. He used the vessel as a trap. He identified a vulnerable target. Her name was Colleen Wood. She was 53 years old. She was an office manager who had recently relocated from Ohio to Florida, looking for a geographical change and a fresh start. She held liquid assets and was entirely unaware of his forensic history. Senior deployed the same calculated, aggressive charm he used to negotiate massive cartel shipments in the 1970s. He presented himself as a wealthy, retired racing champion. He deliberately scrubbed his federal convictions from his personal narrative. He completely omitted his status as the primary suspect in the 1981 disappearance of his previous wife, Chalice. He analyzed Wood's situation, found the structural weaknesses in her life, and exploited them. He initiated a systematic extraction protocol. He convinced Wood to completely detach from her established life. He instructed her to sell her condominium. He told her to liquidate her physical assets. He persuaded her to move all her capital into highly accessible bank accounts, quit her job, and board the Diamond Girl. He promised her a 5-year sailing expedition around the world. It was a calculated isolation tactic. By December 2000, Wood was entirely cut off from her support network. She was living on an isolated boat, completely controlled by an apex predator. Sometime in mid-December 2000, the timeline abruptly stopped. Colleen Wood ceased to exist. She made no phone calls. She sent no emails. She did not board any commercial flights. Her physical footprint completely evaporated in the humid Florida air. John Paul Sr. did not contact the United States Coast Guard. He did not walk into a police precinct to file a missing persons report. He replicated the exact same operational silence he utilized when his second wife vanished 2 decades earlier. He simply remained on the boat and went about his daily routine. Wood's family triggered the alarm. They realized she was missing and contacted the Fort Lauderdale police. Detectives initiated a missing persons investigation. They immediately focused on the boyfriend. They ran his name through the National Crime Information Center database. the federal racketeering convictions, the 5-shot execution attempt on a federal witness, and the unclosed Key West homicide investigation immediately lit up the police monitors. Detectives bypassed the boat and went straight to the financial records. The banking data provided a cold, hard narrative. Colleen Wood was gone, but her money was highly active. Forensic accountants tracked a series of systematic ATM withdrawals and credit card charges. John Paul Sr. was bleeding her accounts dry. He drained over $38,000 from her life savings. He maxed out her credit lines. He used the stolen funds to finance his daily operations and maintain the boat. The most chilling data point pulled from the investigation was not the financial theft. It was the audacity. Detectives discovered Sr. was actively using Wood's money to purchase personal advertisements in local South Florida newspapers. He was soliciting new female companions to join him on the exact same boat where Wood was last seen alive. He was openly hunting for the next target while spending the previous target's money. The Fort Lauderdale Police Department coordinated with federal parole officers. The systematic financial theft and his direct association with a missing person constituted massive parole violations. The federal government drafted the warrants. They prepared to execute a raid on the Diamond Girl, put him in heavy iron shackles, and drag him back to a maximum security penitentiary. They miscalculated his surveillance capabilities. Sr. sensed the incoming raid. He did not wait for the steel handcuffs. In April 2001, he fired up the twin diesel engines of the Diamond Girl. He slipped his moorings. He navigated out of the Fort Lauderdale Marina, breached the international water boundary, and completely vanished into the Atlantic Ocean. Law enforcement agencies launched a massive maritime manhunt. The FBI issued a new sequence of federal warrants for his arrest. They flagged his passport. They alerted Interpol. The response was completely ineffective. Finding a 55-foot boat in the open ocean is a logistical nightmare. John Paul Sr. possessed decades of high-level maritime smuggling experience. He knew how to disable transponders. He knew how to forge harbor manifests. He knew how to navigate off the primary shipping grids and avoid Coast Guard patrols. Sightings were reported across the globe. Informants placed his boat in the Bahamas. Unverified intelligence tracked him to the South Pacific, suggesting he docked in Fiji. Other rumors placed him operating within the underground expatriate communities of Thailand. None of the intelligence resulted in a confirmed visual identification or a tactical breach. The federal files remained open, gathering dust in FBI field offices. He outran the heavy machinery of the United States government. He erased his victims, stole their capital, and disappeared into the salt water, leaving behind a completely cold forensic trail. John Paul Jr. surrendered his competition license and walked away from the asphalt in 2001. The diagnosis of Huntington's disease was an absolute biological mandate. His body initiated a systematic structural collapse. The disease targeted his basal ganglia. The mutated protein aggressively destroyed the neurons in his brain. The physical deterioration was not immediate. It was a slow, agonizing loss of mechanical control. The man who possessed the extreme upper body strength, required to wrestle a heavily turbocharged Porsche 935 through the high banks of Daytona for 24 consecutive hours, began to lose control of his own hands. The precision required to hit a racing apex at 180 miles per hour evaporated. His muscles misfired. His vocal cords degraded. His ability to swallow food became a critical choking hazard. He was eventually confined to a wheelchair. He was moved into a specialized neurological care facility in Woodland Hills, California. He spent nearly 2 decades trapped inside a failing biological chassis. The racing community did not abandon him. Former competitors, mechanics, and team owners traveled to the facility. They walked into the room and saw the physical wreckage. They saw a champion stripped of his physical agency. They did not offer hollow, sentimental pity. They offered cold respect for his survival instinct. Junior fought the neurological decay with the same stubborn endurance he used to fight factory-backed racing teams. He outlived the initial medical projections by years. He refused to let the disease execute him on its own schedule. But human biology has strict operational limits. The central nervous system can only sustain so much catastrophic damage before the primary system shut down entirely. On December 29, 2020, the final system failure occurred. John Paul Jr. was 60 years old. He died in his bed in the Woodland Hills facility. The attending physician noted the time of death. The medical examiner confirmed the obvious truth. There was no high-speed impact. There was no burning racing fuel. There was no blunt force trauma. The official cause of death was recorded as complications from Huntington's disease. His physical remains were processed by the mortuary. The autopsy reports confirmed the severe, irreversible degradation of his brain tissue. The fastest young driver in IMSA history was dead, executed by a genetic mutation he inherited from his family bloodline. At the exact moment the coroner zipped up John Paul Jr.'s body bag in California, the FBI databases continued to actively run search algorithms for his father. John Paul Sr. did not attend his son's funeral. He did not send a legal representative. He was a highly classified international fugitive. The federal warrants for racketeering, parole violation, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution remained fully active. Detectives in Key West still maintained the open homicide file for Chalice Paul. Investigators in Fort Lauderdale still maintained the open missing persons file for Colleen Wood. Law enforcement possessed massive volumes of circumstantial evidence, seized bank records, and witness testimonies. They possessed everything except the prime suspect. If John Paul Sr. is still alive today, he is a man in his late 80s. But there is no forensic confirmation of his existence. There are no recent photographs. There are no intercepted phone calls. There are no confirmed wire transfers. He has completely evaded the multi-million-dollar surveillance apparatus of the United States government. The maritime smuggling networks he built in the 1970s have been completely dismantled and replaced by modern cartels. The heavily modified Porsche prototypes he funded with drug money are now million-dollar museum pieces. The millions of dollars he stole from his victims are gone. He is a ghost in the machine. He successfully erased his own footprint from the planet. The JLP racing empire is a dark stain on the history of American motorsport. The record books show their Daytona and Sebring victories. The federal court dockets show the exact cost of those trophies. You can bolt a driver into a custom tubular space frame. You can surround him with fire suppression systems, carbon Kevlar crash structures, and high-impact retaining walls. You can survive a massive kinetic impact at 200 miles per hour and walk away from the twisted metal, but the track ends, the concrete walls stop. The off-track demons do not observe the checkered flag. Greed, violent pathology, and biological failure are the ultimate equalizers. John Paul Sr. chose the cartel and disappeared into the void. John Paul Jr. chose the race car and suffocated in his own failing body.